I remember the small town of Sanok as if it were yesterday, though it's been a decade since I left. Nestled in the hills of southeastern Poland, it was a place where time seemed to crawl and the forest felt alive, as if they breathed along with the seasons. Our home was on the edge of town, where the cobbled streets faded into the dense wilderness. My parents relished the peace and isolation, which made the horrors that unfolded all the more chilling. My father, a retired professor, and my mother, with her kind eyes and gentle hands, were devoted to our quiet life. Our home, a modest house with a thatched roof and ivy creeping up its sides, stood alone against the encroaching forest. They loved the isolation, but it was this very seclusion that would soon become our undoing. It started in the summer I turned 14. The sun blazed fiercely, turning the garden into a scorched wasteland. It was then that we began to hear the scratching noises at night, soft at first but growing louder with each passing evening. I would lie in bed listening to the sounds coming from the walls, like claws scraping against wood. My parents insisted it was just the house settling, but I knew something was wrong. One night the scratching turned into something far worse. I was lying awake when I heard a guttural growl coming from the woods. It was a sound that seemed to rip through the night, primal and hungry. I dared to peek through my window and saw shadows moving among the trees, undulating in ways that defied nature. Eyes glowed yellow in the darkness, watching me with an intensity that sent icy chills down my spine. My parents grew increasingly distant, their faces etched with a fear I couldn't quite understand. They spoke in hushed tones and locked the doors early, but the atmosphere in the house was thick with dread. Their behavior became erratic. My father would sit for hours staring into the fireplace, while my mother's once gentle touch turned to frantic, jittery motions. One evening, driven by desperation and curiosity, I ventured into the woods. The oppressive heat made every step feel like a slog through molasses. The trees closed in around me, their twisted branches seeming to whisper and call my name. The deeper I went, the more suffocating the darkness became, until I stumbled into a clearing. In the center stood an ancient oak, its bark gnarled into grotesque faces, twisted and warped. Around its base were symbols, runes that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. A shiver ran through me as I felt a cold presence wash over me. It was then I heard the scream, a bone-chilling, unearthly wail that made my skin crawl. I turned to leave, but the forest seemed to conspire against me. The ground beneath me shifted, as if the trees themselves were closing in. I heard the cracking of branches and the sound of something moving rapidly behind me. Panic surged through me. I sprinted through the woods, branches slapping my face, roots tripping me up. I could hear the growls getting closer, feel the breath of something foul on the back of my neck. As I burst from the woods and into the yard, I could see my house lit up like a beacon. The front door was ajar and my parents stood in the doorway, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. I ran inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My parents were different, pale and hollow-eyed, their movements jerky and unnatural. That night I awoke to the sound of the door being scratched at. My parents, now almost zombie-like, moved toward the door, their expressions vacant. I begged them to stop, but they seemed lost in some trance. The scratching outside grew louder, more insistent, like claws dragging across metal. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door just a crack, peering out into the night. What I saw made my blood run cold. A creature with a face like a twisted mask, eyes glowing an eerie yellow, stood at the edge of the forest. It was covered in black, matted fur, and its long claws scraped relentlessly against the door. The legend my parents had always dismissed, a being known as the Strigoi, was real, and it was here. I slammed the door shut, and my parents recoiled, hissing and scratching at the walls. The Strigoi was relentless. It seemed to sense my fear, feeding off it, growing stronger with each passing moment. I managed to drag my parents away from the door, barricading it with furniture. But it wasn't long before the creature found another way in. I knew I had to escape. As I fled through the back door and into the forest, I could hear the Strigoi's screeches echoing behind me. The creature was relentless, its howls tearing through the night air. I ran until I could run no more, collapsing at the edge of town as dawn broke. When the authorities found me, They searched the house and the woods but found no trace of my parents. It was as if they had been swallowed by the earth itself. They labeled it a disappearance, but I knew better. The Strigoi had claimed them, leaving nothing but the haunted memories of that night. Now, a decade later, I still hear that unearthly wail in my nightmares. The Strigoi still roams the forest, and the shadows of Sanok will forever hold the echoes of its monstrous cries. I fear that the next time the wind howls through the trees, it might carry a whisper meant for me.